everyone. Um, I'm Jacqueline. I'm a board member of Women's Political Collaborative, and I'm so excited to be the moderator of this discussion with the author of Valley So Low, quite the subtitle, One Lawyer's Fight for Justice in the Wake of America's Great Coal Catastrophe. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Jared Sullivan is such a great source of knowledge when it comes to um, obviously what this book is about, TVA and a company they hired um, to clean up the coal spill that happened in 2008. Jared is a journalist, and this book is his debut, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so take it away, Jared.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. In a couple of these online things now. I feel like they work best when people just fire away questions as they come up, and I'll do my best to answer them as as I kind of go through my little spiel. But don't hesitate to answer questions in the chat. And Jack will also please jump in too if you have questions or if you feel like if I've gone down a tangent, please.
Oh,
Uh,
that reminds me, for housekeeping, if anyone has questions, to please put it in the chat and just, I believe the protocol is to have yourselves muted and such, just so that we can maintain some order, because I'm sure you all have a lot of questions.
Um, Great. Well, I guess I'll just go from there. So, hi, yes, my name is Jared Sullivan. I grew up in Franklin, south of Nashville. I am a journalist. I've written for the New Yorker and the Atlantic, and gosh, where else? Oxford American. I used to be an editor at Men's Journal and Field and Stream. That's kind of where I came up. And I spent the last 5 years, or yeah, 5 years writing this book. Valley, it's blurry, too bad. Valley So Low. It's about the 2008 Kingston coal ash disaster outside of Knoxville. And it centers on a lawyer named Jim Scott, who's an attorney based in Knoxville. And his whole cast of kind of characters, but also it focuses a lot on TVA. I also like the legal system. I feel like I'm not a lawyer, so to me, it was like a 5 year journey and and the American legal system and beginning to wrap my head around it, and it was very, very fascinating. I think the case, my book follows a lawsuit, and I feel like the case exemplifies a lot of things that could be improved with the American legal system. But we can get into that. Um, so first, I guess I'll just start from the beginning, just how my book opens. It December 28, excuse me, December 22nd, 2008. In the town of Kingston, Tennessee, which like this is this tiny hamlet outside of Knoxville, about 30 minutes outside of Knoxville. There's a TVA power plant there. TVA is the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's a New Deal agency created to bring power to the people of Tennessee, but also parts of six neighboring states. We'll get into more into TVA in a second. But outside of in Kingston, there was a 6 story tall, 84 acre mound of what's called coal ash. And coal ash is whenever you burn coal to produce electricity, it leaves behind this sooty stuff called coal ash, and it's full of arsenic and beryllium, and it's pretty nasty. So over the decades, this power plant, this all the waste had grown to like this big mountain. So in the middle of the night on December 22nd, 2008, this mound collapsed and it made national news. And I'm just going to read just a few short paragraphs just to help set the scene of kind of of what of how the kind of book opens. And this is only just a couple paragraphs. So, as the clock approached midnight, a stiff wind blew over the rolling countryside that surrounded the Kingston fossil plant. It was the winter solstice, and in the quiet of that long night, the old farmhouses, country churches, trailer homes, and lakeside estates that dotted the hills and coves around the power station were dark and still. Christmas trees glowed in living rooms. The Year Without a Santa Claus played on TVs. Outside, the temperature hovered close to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. cold enough to freeze the pipes of the McDonald's in town. Then, shortly before 1 o'clock, the north section of the coal ash dike suddenly and almost wholly collapsed. When it did, more than 1 billion gallons of coal ash slurry, about 1,500 times the volume of liquid that flows over Niagara Falls each second, broke forth. A black wave, at least 50 feet high, rushed forward with the power and violence of water punching through a dam. A backwater inlet separated the coal ash pond from a small peninsula along the Emery River. A few dozen homes sat along the water's edge. As the black wave roared ahead, shaking the earth, it overwhelmed the inlet and slammed into the peninsula. Most of the slurry, nearly 6 million tons in all, forked right around the obstruction and rushed into the Emery River, filling in a 40-foot deep channel. The rest of the ash, nearly 3 million tons, filled in two sloughs on either side of the peninsula, hurling fish 40 feet onto the riverbank. The wave kept going. It downed trees, covered roads, and knocked out power lines. Docks were inundated, boats were carried away, soccer fields were smothered. Stop there. So that just gives you the sense of the this big mound collapsing. And when it did, it covered 300 acres, and it is the largest to date, the largest industrial environmental disaster in U.S. history, 100 times larger than Exxon Valdez, 1 billion gallons of coal ash sludge, covered the landscape. So after this happened, and this is where my book starts, after this happened, this big disaster, union reps started working the phones saying, we have a big mess in our hands. Fortunately, no one died during the collapse, but it was very clear that TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, needed to get this coal ash stuff cleaned out the road because roads are covered and there's a train line that got covered too. So union reps start calling people all over the country, and 900 men and women descend on Kingston, Tennessee to clean this up. And but remember, it's 2008. The economy is on its knees. The housing market and stock market had just collapsed. So for these blue collar workers who come to Kingston, they know it's like a huge they knew it's a huge mess. They knew that TVA had royally screwed up and not fortifying this big coal ash pond. That's what they call them, ponds. Not really ponds. They're, these big giant structures. But for them, for these blue collar workers, it was really a godsend because many of them were out of work. And so it was a real blessing. So my book I got to know very well. My book follows this one particular worker named Ansel Clark, who was grew up in Knoxville, was a veteran, and didn't go to college, but had worked hard his whole life. And him and his wife Janie, who's another ends up being another kind of main character in the book, they built like a nice little respectable, lives for themselves. And so my book follows Ansel as he starts cleaning up this coal ash stuff, and as he and these other 900 workers start ex hauling this stuff away, TVA and one of its main reps, Jacobs Engineering, which is a large federal contract, they were in charge of safety. So if you hear me say Jacobs, that's what I'm talking about. It's not an individual; it's a large multi-billion-dollar company. They also do work for NASA and like the various Middle Eastern governments and all this stuff. They're a huge government contractor, top 20 at one point. So as these workers start digging up this coal ash, start hauling it away, TV, they're told repeatedly that coal ash is not it poses no significant threat to their health. It's basically fine. And so it's and Ansel and the other workers basically take TVA and Jacobs at their word for this because TVA was kind of it was they're like TVA was a good guy. It helped lift the region out of poverty during the Great Depression. It employed 10,000 people directly in East Tennessee, not to mention all sorts of other indirect employment benefits from that. So that was so Ansel and the other blue collar workers basically trusted TVA. And I'll just take a step back. For me personally, like, before I started this call, one of the hosts was asking me how I found this story. Well, I found this story because I grew up in Franklin. I remember watching on TV like coverage of the spill. I also very clearly remember TVA's PR people getting on News Channel 5 and saying, "Oh yes, we've made a big mess. We're really sorry, but this coal ash stuff poses no significant health risk." I remember thinking like, "Oh great, like what luck that this stuff is not toxic." Well, it turns out it was toxic. So how I got turned on to the story was 10 years later in 2018, I was an editor at Men's Journal magazine in New York City, and part of my job there was to find stories and have people go write them. Well, I started reading these, so I kept a careful eye on news from the South because I'm from here and I care about it. So I came across these courtroom dispatches in the Knoxville News Sentinel about these sick workers, and that's when I was like, okay, I knew exactly what the case. I remember the spill. I remember all these memories kind of came rushing back to me. So that's how I basically started. I spent the next 5 years of my life reporting about what happened. So, anyways, that's kind of just a sidebar about my how I got involved in all of this. But back to the workers. So, I guess I should talk about TVA first because I feel like TVA is a huge part of the story. And I feel like TVA has done so many great things for this country and for this state, and I think it's gone horribly astray. In many ways, it's like huge, one of the nation's largest polluters. Um, it certainly did not provide for these workers, which I'll get into more um, in a minute. But I do think it's important to talk about TVA because it is of vital importance. So basically, the story goes, the history of TVA really starts with Franklin Roosevelt. As a young man, he contracted polio and began making trips to Warm Springs, Georgia for treatment. And on the way, he passed through the Tennessee Valley and got a firsthand look about how destitute this region was. And the Tennessee Valley, it's a 42,000 square mile region. It's not just strictly Tennessee, as I kind of said earlier. It, and the Tennessee Valley had never really recovered from the Civil War a generation earlier in 1929. The poverty was so crushing that it really challenged the notion of whether a democracy could care for its people, and whether the American experiment had vitality. And this is I think one of the craziest stats in the book. But in 1933, only 3% of farms in the Tennessee Valley had electricity, and in cities, well, 70%. Per capita income, the people in the Tennessee Valley made less than half of the national average. It's the equivalent of made the equivalent of $6,000 in 2024 dollars when adjusted for inflation. I mean, imagine trying to live off $6,000 a year. It's people here really had nothing. In the mountains, families, I found all these documents, these families surviving in crude shacks with walls plastered with newspaper and flour paste. Babies died of what they called summer complaint, which is diarrhea and heat exposure, some kind of combination of both. Malaria was endemic. Typhoid was rampant. The timberlands were overcut. 6 million acres of farmland were eroded. So it was a very, very desperate situation. And FDR knew this. So when he was elected president, he quickly created, with help of Congress, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And it had three main goals. And the goals were to provide electricity, to control flooding, because the Tennessee River regularly flooded and would washed away whole towns. I believe it was in the 1870s. The city of Chattanooga got almost wiped away. And so you cannot develop your economy. You cannot develop as a society if your town is getting washed away every few dozen years, right? So again, like the goals were provide electricity to spur the economy, control the river, and also improve agriculture. TVA set up like 10,000 demonstration farms where they taught farmers how to improve their crop yields. I guess they didn't have very savvy techniques here at the time. And the amazing thing about TVA is that it actually worked. I think it's one of the great American success stories of like good government in action. It's so easy to take like pot shots at the federal government for whatever reasons, but TVA was a huge, huge, huge success and should be remembered as such. Within the less than 2 decades, per capita income had risen by like two or threefold. It was within, I think it got up to like 80% of the national average by 1960, which is a huge jump in a relatively short period of time. And that's all because that's largely because of TVA, because when you have electricity, we have a lot of factories, especially in East Tennessee, that moved in, and uh, TVA itself employed 40,000 workers to build dams all up and down the Tennessee River. There's 49 dams in all, 29 of which were power producing. So I think it's a great American success story. Its problems really began, and I'll try to keep this brief, but the problems really began after World War II. It's because, well, during World War II, the Army decided to build Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in Oak Ridge. It started to create Oak Ridge, Tennessee, rather, in Oak Ridge, because they needed TVA's electricity to build the atomic bomb, and that spiked demand for TVA's power. At one point in the 50s, almost half of TVA's power went to Oak Ridge specifically. And after World War II, demand for energy only rose because it was the Cold War, and Oak Ridge obviously did not shut down after World War II. It continued to uh, ramp up production. Well, so to meet demand, TVA threw up or built rather 11 of the world's largest, most technically complex coal-fired power plants to meet demand of defense industries, but also after World War II, we had AC, so it made living in the South much more tolerable. So after World War II, a bunch of folks migrated south because it was now they could stand the heat. But that drove up electricity demand even more. So this is TVA got in a situation where it needed to build these power plants, but Congress, when President Eisenhower hated TVA, he accused it of being an example of, quote, creeping socialism. He wanted to kneecap it, he wanted to sell it off, and his Republican colleagues in Congress repeatedly withheld appropriations from TVA to build the power plants it needed, even though half TVA's power went to the defense industries, even though half the power went directly to support the government. Um, so what TVA had to do, and I believe it was 1959, they had to switch from getting appropriations like a normal federal agency to they started funding projects by selling bonds, basically, which allowed them to raise their own money and run up debt. But because of that, TVA, after that, like Congress, because TVA no longer needed appropriations, Congress basically stopped paying attention to it. And that I like uh, is really when TVA's problems started because the government to be effective, I feel like it needs good accountability. It needs stakeholders who are passionate about its mission, and TVA has kind of like lost all of that in the years since. No, very little accountability from Congress, even though it's still like technically, it is owned by the federal government still, but Congress pays it very little attention, uh, which is a a true shame because TVA did great things for so many years. Then TVA got more in a pickle because in the, in the 60s, it planned to build seven jumbo nuclear power plants because it thought electricity demand was going to go up even more. And it was just like a disaster. The whole program was a disaster. Its first plant was Browns Ferry in North Alabama. There was a huge fire. I don't really understand quite what happened because I'm not an electrician, but it was like an electrician was using like a lit candle to look for an air leak or something in like a piece of equipment, and it caught like this whole area of the power plant on fire. It had to be an emergency shutdown, and it cost millions and millions of dollars of damage. That was like the most like noteworthy disaster at TVA's nuclear plants, but all of its plants suffered from cost overruns and from safety issues. So TVA wanted to build seven plants. It only built three of them, but it burned all this money because like there's a bunch of like half-built nuclear plants in the South or in the Tennessee Valley because it couldn't finish them all. So it's which is to me it's American tragedy because now jump ahead, this happened in the 70s, jump ahead to today. TVA does not have enough power now, we had during this big winter storm we had here, I guess a month ago, TVA could not supply all of its customers with power, but had to buy power from some of the East Coast grids. And that should not be happening. TV, this region is booming. We have a lot of people wanting to move here, and I really wish we had the seven nuclear power plants. We have three, which is better than nothing, but it is a real shame that we don't have those I mean, no emissions power plants now. And nuclear is not perfect. TVA, like I said, they've had some hair-raising incidents at their plants, but I feel like, in my view, uh, nuclear is problematic. Coal and fossil fuels pose like an existential threat to our country. So I feel like nuclear is definitely the way to go. And TVA also used to do like a lot of other dynamic things. Like they have this Raccoon Mountain south of Chattanooga, which is I think one of the coolest TVA projects. They basically took like a big mountain or hill and they kind of like carved it out. And they fill it with water. It's how it works is basically like at night when the demand for energy is low, but their nuclear power plants are still running because you can't really they run the nuclear power plants for multiple days. They don't really just shut them off at night like you can at other plants. So at night when they have all this excess power, they fill up Raccoon Mountain with water. Then the day when energy demand rises, they drain it. I guess there's a turbine in the bottom of that generates power, and Raccoon Mountain can generate as much power as a I think it can light 700,000 homes, something like that. It can light power as many homes as a nuclear power plant, and it's totally emissions free. It's very cool. And TVA used to be do ambitious cool things like that. And I am rooting. I hope I live to see the day that TVA again does big ambitious clean energy projects like that because it would be a real benefit to the people of the state and to this country if it could. So um, that's my little TVA spiel. There's a lot of TVA rightly gets a lot of negative coverage. My book is very critical of TVA. I'll circle back and talk more about the cleanup and the disaster at Kingston in a second. But TVA rightly gets a lot of um, negative press coverage because it deserves it. But I've also seen some environmental groups like take a lot of shots at TVA. I feel like I think people's posture should be like we should reform TVA and make it as great as it could be, not saying, not give, I don't think it should be privatized. I don't think it should be sold off. It could be great again, with the right reforms. That's the main thing that's lacked. This is a quick sidebar. TVA, like, it's initially like in the 30s, it not only made power and had dams, but also had all these like utopian like side projects that it tried to do to like improve like how do I say it, like improve Southerners
Quality of life.
yeah, I guess so. They had like a mobile library service. They had Plain Community Norris. They had a ceramic studio, which is funny to think about. I mean, it's hard to imagine the federal government ever doing some of that today, but they really tried. I guess I think those examples are amusing because it really shows that TV was trying to uplift the people's like economically, but also like uplift make them more refined, I don't know, members of society, which I believe is an admirable thing that they attempt to do, especially because it was Tennessee in the 1920s was basically Tennessee in the 1830s or 1820s rather, still far behind the rest of the country. So, um, yeah, so um, I'm like, I want to root for, anyways, I want to root for TVA. I think every Tennessean should be rooting for TVA. I read something in my research that kind of broke my heart a little bit it was an academic saying if TVA was in any other part of the country, if it was in New York, if it was in California or whatever, New England, the public outrage would be so great that it couldn't get away with like half the stuff it gets away with. So I feel like that's kind of a critique of us, the people of Tennessee, because yes, there are a lot of people who do pay attention to TVA, but I feel like we as a state should be demanding much more of TVA, and we should demand that it is responsive to our needs. And I really hope business leaders pay attention to TVA because I mean, it was created to boost the economy. Like it was lower, uh, small s socialism intended to help private enterprise lift everyone's, uh, lift this area out of poverty, and it worked. And so this area would benefit if we had more cheaper, abundant electricity. And right now, that used to be the case where electricity in Tennessee, our rates were substantially lower than the rest of the country, but that is no longer true. And I mean, I feel like our lawmakers should be grilling TVA. Like, why do we not have the lowest power costs in the country? Like our state, Tennessee, still has a very high poverty rate compared to the rest of the country. Our GDP per capita lags many other states. We could really use more economic development in this state. Nashville has been very lucky over the past 50, 20 years, I guess. We've had it's been a boom times for Nashville and some of the other parts of the state too, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I feel like having cheaper power rates could have more factories move here, encourage more startups start here, all these things. So I really hope if any of y'all are business-minded folks do pay attention to TVA, and because it could be a tool to make the state even better than it is. So um,
And where's TVA getting their energy? Where, like, can you tell us a little bit about how they are transitioning off of coal, or why
yeah.
rates are going up?
Um, Yeah. So first of all, I should say my book is like a totally character-driven book. I don't get into all this walkie. My whole book is not like a policy paper about TVA. It's really character-driven about these people at the disaster site and about this lawyer. It's like I try to write like a law thriller, right? Because as much as I like to nerd out about TVA, I know people only have so much, can only stand so much of that. So I try to write like a legal page turner. So, but I'll get to that in a minute. But to answer your question, where does TVA get its power now? Is that your question? It still has 29 hydroelectric dams. It has three nuclear power plants, and it has slowly converted its ever since the Kingston disaster, basically, ever since the Kingston disaster was what made TVA finally try to get off coal. So it's converted most of its coal-fired power plants to natural gas. Natural gas has about half the emissions rate as coal, um, but still like a highly pollutinous material. And I honestly feel like, well, I feel like these natural gas plants are pretty cheap to build, relatively speaking. So I feel like it's almost like a band-aid. It's not like a permanent solution, in my view. The problem is that TVA has so much debt from its bungled power plants in the 60s and 70s that this is kind of wonky, but bear with me. In Congress, they gave TVA in the 70s a $30 billion debt limit. Now that was nominal, um, meaning it does not rise with inflation. That's so TVA still has a $30 billion debt limit, and right now it's $20 billion in debt. So it only has $10 billion worth of. Did I say that right? It's $30 billion cap. It has 20 billion. Yeah, so there's 10 billion of wiggle room to finance new projects. Well, a nuclear power plant, a big one, costs more than $10 billion, right? So they can only really afford right now uh, to build natural gas plants.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm sure we could get a little bit wonkier about that, but I wanted to ask, let's see, I do see a question. I wish TVA could create an electronic passenger train system for.
uh, that's a I've TVA. It's that's a great idea.
Um,
TV TVA has all this land. They could do something really cool. I've had that thought about passenger train because they have all this land alongside their rivers. They could build train lines alongside many of the rivers of Tennessee because they own much property, but I don't think there's that much appetite. I mean, TVA now it's all profit driven because of the changes in the in the 50s, but maybe one day we live in hope, right? What's the question in the chat?
let's see.
Oh,
Yeah. Do you want me to read it just because it's
sure.
been
Yeah, for the record. Sure, 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 sure.
yeah. So in your research, Maggie asked, how much did people that you interviewed seem to know about TVA's operations and history? Maggie said, I also grew up in Franklin and I never formally learned much about it beyond the basic facts, but I don't know if that is common across the state.
Yeah, I think, and I grew up in Middle Tennessee. I had a very like tech, I had a very like short, I had very brief, very limited understanding of TVA. I think like a lot of people, I knew it was like a New Deal thing. But I didn't really know much beyond that. Um, maybe this is, I don't know. I wish it should have a bigger place in our state textbooks because it actually worked. I think that would maybe run counter to the political ideology of many of our state leaders saying, "Oh, the government came in and they really helped us." But that is like the absolute fact. I mean, Tennessee's a very our local lawmakers are very what do you call, opposed to federal intervention and whatnot. But there's no denying that TVA rescued rescued the state and rescued the South. But um, people don't like
Well,
to
and
talk about that. But so how much?
in
So in East Tennessee, where I met people, I feel like in East Tennessee do have a generally a better understanding. TVA is a more visible presence in East Tennessee than in Middle Tennessee. People don't know the whole history, but it's more like, well, my daddy worked there and his daddy worked there, and they don't maybe people I met didn't maybe understand the grand historical arc of TVA, but they're like, oh, uh, I know a lot about this one particular plant where my dad worked, or for example. So, um, I guess I'll circle back to my book real fast. So my book, like I said, is a law story. So all these blue collar workers, they come to help clean this stuff up. TVA at first says coal ash is not harmful, really. Like, don't worry about it. But then work they start the workers start being denied dust masks. They start getting so sick, they start passing out in their cars. They start vomiting up blood. Then they have heart issues, lung issues. They get so sick that they start asking for dust masks, and they're repeatedly told no, again and again and again. Some workers, even allege that they were fired for asking for dust masks. I found a video, or I obtained a video where a worker goes up to it. This is on tape, so I know for a fact it happened. A cleanup worker goes up to his, I guess you'd call it like a supervisor, and asks, what would happen if I brought a dust mask to the job site? And the safety officer says, don't hang yourself with your own cock. But that's what he says. Basically meaning like you'll be sacrificing your job if you brought a dust mask on the site. Which when I saw that, like my eyes popped out of my head. It's like that is outrageous. And I should say like dust. This whole most of the time at the job site, dust is flying around. This coal ash stuff is all in the air. I've seen photos of it just caking the workers' bodies. It was all over them. The stuff was full of arsenic, but the workers were repeatedly told again and again, no, you can't wear dust masks. And the reason why, I think there's two reasons, or two things. One was that the public that lived around the plant was super upset that TVA had almost 30 homes were damaged by the spill, but also many homes that were not damaged. Their beautiful waterfront property were covered in coal sludge because the plant's not along a river. And anyway, so a lot of like vacation homes, like retirees. So TVA after the disaster, they came out and said, "Oh, this stuff is cost stuff is not doesn't pose a threat." So I think if the community would have seen the workers out there stomping around in hazmat suits after the fact, they would have gotten very upset, saying, "Well, you told us that the coal ash stuff isn't hazardous, but yet all your workers are in hazmat suits." So I think that would have been a disaster for TVA. Um, Then the other part of it, I think, is just the time, because if the workers wore hazmat suits, which in my view they should have. Well, Tennessee, newsflash, it's hot in the summers, right? Well, if you're wearing head to toe hazmat suit, um, federal safety rules require you to take breaks every so often, right? So if the workers would have taken a break, it means they would have had to leave the job site, get on like a shuttle, take the shuttle to a break area, derobe, take their break, put their gear back on, take a shuttle back to the job site. And there's hundreds of people working on this job site, right? That so to go through those such precautions would have slowed the whole project up. And the EPA had given TVA very tight deadlines in which to finish this cleanup project. So it would have added hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on top of the already expensive cleanup. Cleanup ended up costing $1 billion. So I think I think there's strong evidence that suggests that TVA was just like, we can't spend the time to equip everyone with the proper safety equipment. And I found a transcript. I used the Internet Archive, which is a great resource. I went back to TVA's website back to 2008. You can kind of like rewind their website. It's like in history. That's what the Internet Archive does. I found a transcript from a meeting from 2009 where TVA senior vice president promises a group of people at like a public meeting that the cleanup workers will have hazmat suits within 2 weeks. Tells that to one of the workers' wives, and it just never happened. I mean, she just lied to their faces, which is really despicable. And we should be demanding much better of TVA. So, these worker stories are like are so heartbreaking because there's like average hardworking folks who kind of busted their butts their whole lives, like to save a little and build comfortable little lives for themselves. You know, I do follow some of the workers in the book very closely, but I also follow this lawyer named Jim Scott, attorney from Knoxville. And Jim Scott, he has like a bird's nest of hair. He's a short little guy, very spirited to say the least. Has a lot of heart, but he's not Mr. High powered attorney, right? He didn't work. He worked for himself basically. He did not work for a big law firm, but he had a good reputation in the community. So when these workers start getting sick, they hear that this Jim Scott guy, if you want someone to listen to you, he's the one to go to. So a group of them showed up to his office on Kingston Pike out in Knoxville and basically said, here's what's happening. We think we're getting sick, and Jacobs Engineering is denying us respiration death mask. And Jim had a lot of heart, and he spent basically 10 years of his life and kind of wrecked his life dragging their case through the federal court system. And it was a brutal case. And basically they had to convince the jury that Jacobs Engineering should have provided workers with dust masks and respirators and didn't. And that they were, as a result of that, liable for these. Was Jim from Roane County? Yes, he grew up in Roane. He grew up, or no, excuse me, Jim grew up in Anderson County, which is adjacent to Roane County. But Jim was as assistant D early in his career, like in his 20s, he was an assistant DA in Roane County. So he had a lot of connections in that community. So even though he lived in Knoxville at the time, people still knew him in the area, and that's kind of how the workers got in touch with him. And
I really like what you said at the on the call with the Sunrise Movement um, in Nashville a couple months ago, and you said that you were inspired by, if I'm getting this right, correct me if I'm wrong, you were inspired by Aaron Brockovich fighting hexavalent chromium, I believe. And so you wanted like a Jim Scott equivalent, like Aaron
yeah,
Brockovich is to Jim
well,
Scott as that chemical is to coal ash, is that right?
yeah, basically, I mean, so like when you're writing a story, you want someone you want a hero. You want someone. I think we all want heroes, right? Like the news is so bleak now. Like we want people. Like, it's not just a human thing. I just like to want a hero, to want someone to cheer for. And all these book events I've been doing, I was like, does anyone remember the name of the chemical that sickened all those people in Hinckley, California? That, and the answer is no, but oh, do you remember Erin Brockovich? It's of course, right? Because she's like a dynamic hero. So I knew to tell the story to get people to care about all the wonky stuff I rambled about TVA and about coal ash. I had to find a character um, that you could follow and root for. It also like the workers' stories are like they're kind of like two beats. It's like they worked hard and then they got sick, right? That I couldn't really tell the whole story just through them. I needed uh I needed to follow the lawyers. I felt like to tell this whole story. So that's what I did, and they were interesting. They were like a motley crew of Knoxville lawyers. There's Jim. who's like kind of the scattered, little energetic one. And his pal Keith Stewart is brings in some lawyers to help him the deeper he gets along in the case because he realizes that, and basically the playbook for these kind of cases, these mass toxic tort cases, what they call them, is basically to, like, if you're the company, is to drag it out as long as possible to make the workers, to make the plaintiffs, whatever, capitulate. Like that's the name of the game. It's not really a They don't really care about having to pay their lawyers like more in fees, millions of dollars more in fees, whatever. It's it's they want to avoid a catastrophic um, ruling against them. And so to do that, they drag these cases out, and it becomes very costly for the plaintiffs, attorneys, and that's what Jim ran up against, right? This case went on for 10 years, and he's financing it himself. So eventually, he brings in other attorneys for manpower, but also just like funds to keep the lights on, basically. And they're like I said, they're kind of like a motley crew. Like Keith Stewart is now like he's a very he's a serious attorney now, but as a young man, he was like a cocaine dealer, and he got arrested and was in jail. And while in jail, he started reading law books, and that's what kind of turned his life around, and got into law after that. But he's still kind of rough around the edges. So these are this group of attorneys. I felt it was really fun to get to know them because they're not super slick, like polished attorneys necessarily, um, I still think the workers were lucky to have them on their side because they actually listened to the workers, and they had the grit to push this case ahead for a decade.
How do you feel about that comparison or what have you of David and Goliath?
Well, yeah, I mean it's accurate, but that's typical of these cases. I mean that's how this works. I mean one thing again, I'm not a lawyer. I wasn't I would never pretend to be. Uh, what I realize is like it's always that kind of way. Like I draw a lot of parallels in my book between the Kingston disaster and the sick workers lawsuit and Exxon Valdez. For one, Jacobs hired the same lawyer that Exxon hired after the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And in the playbook is like you drag the case out, like I said, but you also hire like very likable, skilled defense attorneys. And this guy Jim Sanders, he lives in Nashville. He works for a firm called Neal and Harwell that's very well respected. But he is these big companies, the Goliaths, right? They hire very nice faces to represent them in court, very like and their job is basically to lose less. Like I don't think when Exxon or Jacobs or any sorts of companies, Jim Sanders also represented like Ford, or I think Ford and some car crash or like some car defect cases that killed people. They I think they all go into these cases knowing they're going to have to lose, or they'll lose some. They'll have to pay a settlement. So if the name of the game is to pay the smallest settlement possible and drag things out and make people capitulate. And they can do that because they have all the money in the world. I found that, Jacobs Engineering is a publicly traded company, so it has to disclose to shareholders liabilities. And a lawsuit, they have to disclose lawsuits that could potentially harm them. And I found the Jacobs SEC filing where basically said it did not expect the Kingston lawsuits to have any adverse material consequences, I guess, to their cash flows, to their earnings, because it just didn't matter to them. They make, I forget, I think it's like $30 billion. I haven't looked at the number. They make oodles and oodles and oodles of money each year. So that's on one side of the scale. The other side is Jim Scott, small-time lawyer whose office is in a strip mall in Knoxville, and his like other three buddy attorneys. And the system I mean, money corrupts the system where in the sense of just that, not that money corrupts in the sense that, the judge was I think, very ethical in the case and was very rigorous, but it's just the big companies can afford to spend a decade on this and average people can't. And the Exxon
Yes.
Valdez case went on for a decade plus too, and Exxon appealed it so many times that the recovery got, I think that the original recovery was in the billions, but then they appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the final recovery for the fishermen affected by the oil spill was like a tenth of the original of the original recovery, which is just outrageous. I mean, Exxon is not going to learn anything from that, and neither will Jacobs, in my view, from the result of this lawsuit.
So being a legal assistant, aka support staff in law, I can definitely think of a platform of issues in ways that I'd like to improve the legal system. What's one way that, I know you just alluded to one, a huge one. Do you have anything else to say about that?
Yeah, I actually wish I would have talked to more expert. I try not to I've expressed a lot of opinions on this call, but in the book I try not to, I try just to tell the story straight and not interject a lot of like, well, here's my thoughts about like reforming the legal system or even reforming TVA. Like, there's not even that much in there about my view. I tried to really keep myself out of the narrative and keep my own thoughts out of the story. So that's it. I do wish I would have spent more time talking to legal experts. Um, about possible ways to reform the justice system. I'm not going to pretend I'm like the expert on that. I do think we should. I mean, just a big thing was like making cases go faster. I'm not sure how you could do that. I know there's been federal judges have pressure on them to get, violent criminal cases through the courts as fast as possible, or certain cases. I feel like we should have something similar for these to encourage speed because time is when you're a sick and dying worker and your medical bills are piling up. I mean, time is all you have. I mean, excuse me, you don't have time. Time is what's working against you when you're getting ill and ill and ill. And now 50 of these Kingston workers are dead, and many that I knew and talked to them my reporting, they died before they got to see the outcome of the case, which is really, really unfortunate. So, yeah, I wish I had like a smarter, better answer. I mean, but mine simply comes down to like somehow make these things go faster. I'm sure there's legal scholars out there who have ideas about how to do that, but that would be.
Huh? Nuh-uh. What happened to him?
Oh, we'll just ask everyone to be on mute, please. And let's see. Another question, and please feel free to pop yours in the chat. Would be so it sounds like, and I'm more than it sounds like it is the fact that in the United States the or the legal system is the objective is to win rather than to have justice, equitable justice, in my humble opinion. So um, in regards to justice for these workers and justice for anyone who has to deal with coal ash, are there any regulations on coal ash? Is there any hope on that front?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll respond to a question in chat real fast. How many workers now live to see the win in court? I believe by the time the court Well, there was a trial. I think at that point there were about 40 workers who had died, but after the trial, for reasons I really will get into, the case was not really over yet. The first phase of litigation was just about liability, like did Jacobs' actions cause the workers to get sick. There's a second phase after that about each worker had to prove that whether their specific exposures caused their illnesses, which was a whole nother mess. So by the time that happened, by the time the case finally settled in 2023, it was more than 50 workers. I think like 55 workers at that point had died and hundreds were ill. But Jacqueline, back to your question about coal ash. Yeah, so like the Kingston disaster in 2008 led to the first series of rules on coal ash. The first part of it was in the first part was in 2015, where basically the EPA said if you have an active coal ash dump site, which means like the power company's currently dumping coal ash into this big pond thing, right? You have to told power companies they had to monitor it and clean up contamination they found in it. And there's about 750 coal ash ponds throughout the whole United States. So this is not just a TVA problem. This is not just a Tennessee problem. And almost all of these coal ash ponds are unlined pits in the ground. I mean, whole like literally bare earth holes. And most of them are next to rivers because power plants are usually next to rivers for the steam. And almost all of these ponds have been found to leak, right? And so after a lot of delays, the EPA in 2015, and the EPA and TBA, I can get into this later, but they've known for decades that coal ash is hazardous. Uh, the EPA in 2015 said you got to monitor coal ash ponds. Then Trump came into office. He kind of delayed some coal ash rules. Then Biden came into office, and in 20, I think it's 2020, like 2022, early 2023, the EPA said, okay, now these what are called like inactive coal ash ponds. So coal ash ponds that are no longer receiving new shipments of coal ash, you have to monitor those too, and you have to clean up any sites that are contaminated. The problem with, I mean, so like that's a great first step. These are the first national coal ash rules in the country. That's all because of the Kingston disaster. The problem is that these are self-enforcing rules. What does that mean? That means that the EPA does not personally send a representative to check these coal ash ponds. You have to trust the power companies that they will monitor and then be honest about whether they find contamination at their power plants. And you can read my book and decide for yourself whether you trust power companies to be honest about whether there's contamination at their coal ash dump sites. I personally do not. I do not think the rules go far enough. The EPA should have independent people go out and test these sites. I mean, we had environmental groups sued TVA to get to over the Gallatin plant here in Nashville because it was contaminating our groundwater. I don't think all that coal ash has been dug up yet, and so it means it's still contaminating many of our drinking waters.
And we have another question. How many total workers were a part of the suit and or cleanup?
Yeah, it's a great. So there are 900 workers initially who responded to the disaster. Most of them were actually gone within a year or so. And then when that first year or so, the coal ash was like really mucky because it rained a lot that year, and also it flowed into the river. So a lot of it was wet. So it wasn't all up in the air. But then within a couple of years, it did. So that was the first couple of years. 900 people were there. A lot of them left after the first year or two. But that's when, like, circa 2010 is when this coal ash stuff really started to dry out and get in the air. And at that point, the numbers of people on site had declined to a few hundred. So there's 230 workers total on the lawsuits against Jacobs Engineering, which was TVA subcontractor. But a lot of the workers, not a lot, but many were from the South, and from Tennessee, but many also came from places as far as New York State and Florida. And if they had been cued into the news, like there's a decent chance that people came to Kingston and inhaled toxic stuff and now are sick, but they don't either know about the lawsuit, or there's also like what they call like latency periods, which means like the time between you get exposed to a toxin and when you actually get cancer from it or illness from it can be like decades in some cases. So it could be now where like some of the people who were exposed as young adults are just now like getting cancer diagnoses. Um, so I think that explains why 900 people responded to the disaster. Only 230 end up being on the lawsuit. And also, these cases are just also really hard to prove, and you had to have a lot of evidence that you were on the job site these certain days. You had to have evidence that you were working, you personally, not just your colleagues, you personally were working along in dusty, really dusty areas. So it's a high burden to prove, and only about 230 of them, I think the lawyers felt had the evidence to kind of move forward.
And so do you know what the cost was for the cleanup?
The cost was $1 billion for TVA, and all of us paid for that. There was a surcharge on our power bills until I guess it was until 2022. We paid for it. Like that was tacked on. We paid 50, I think 55 cents or something like that on our power bills each month, every TVA ratepayer, to cover that expense. So we paid for TVA's disaster. The workers' lawsuit settled for $77.5 million, and that works out to, after the attorneys take their fee, it works out to about $200,000 on average for the workers, which in my view is nothing. I mean, these were in many cases these workers were like the breadwinners of their family, and in many cases had, years, decades left of work ahead of them, of earnings for their family, and $200,000 uh, does not make up for those lost wages for the family. Plus, obviously the personal toll of losing a loved one, is immense. So, and I get into that in my book. I follow some of the widows of the workers and kind of show their lives before and
Yeah, that was
after
a
most of it.
that was a beautiful part of the book, the wives and their sense of solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like one wife in particular, her name is Janie Clark. We've a close relationship. We talked every day well, not every day, but many times a week for years, if I can tell her story right. And I feel like she secretly kind of becomes like the main character of the book by the end. It's really the book kind of becomes like her story. So
Yeah.
she's a very special person.
Well, thank you so much for telling the story, and um, just thanks for all the work you do. And this will be for CLE credit for those interested. Um, I I could get into the wonky stuff, but um, but with 3 minutes remaining,
Yeah, yeah, sure.
do you have anything else that you would like to? You answered all my questions that I planned. I do have like kind of a, if we want to end on a fun, dare I say fun note, would you, let's see, would you ever want this to be a movie?
Yeah, I do. I mean, yeah, that'd be great. I would help my book sales. So yeah, self-interest. I am very self-interested in that way. That yes, that would be really cool. But I also don't think I like to tell myself this is like a national story and not a just a Tennessee story. Obviously, the disaster was here in Tennessee, but I really feel like people all over the country should care about TVA because it is such an immense importance to this country. It helped us win the war. It helped us win World War II. It's applied more power to defense industries than any other power system. It's applied a tenth of the power. Um, oh, thank you for also the nice words in the chat. I appreciate it. I hope you'll tell all your friends and family about it and tell them to buy millions of copies. So, but yeah, I would love to see it turn into a movie. I'm not holding my breath, but that would be neat. I do feel very fortunate though that I even got to write a book about it. It was a real privilege that the workers let me into their lives and the attorneys let me into their lives and spent countless hours on the phone with me. So I feel very, very privileged that they trusted me to tell their story, and I really hope I got it right. So,
Well, in my opinion, you did, and that I'm reading it a second time.
whoa,
So, just looking forward to that. Let's see, keeping an eye on the chat. My husband is from Clinton, Tennessee, and I have heard about the good TVA did early on, and I have followed the Cole Ash case with interest. I plan to have my book club read your book. Oh, that's so sweet, Jimmy. Um, well, with 1 minute remaining, um, I don't want to let even a second go to waste. Everyone, feel free to populate the chat. Yes, thank you for this wonderful story. Thank you for your time talking to
yeah,
us.
yeah, and I'll say to everyone, first of all, thank you all. Pay attention to TVA; it really matters. Also, I really do care about this story. I care about Tennessee, so I'm happy to talk to like if you're part of like a civic group or whatever, a book club. I am more than happy to chat with you because I want to get this story out. So I'm very easy to reach. You can reach me through my website. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to talk. So yeah, thank you all, and yeah,
I think that concludes our time. Thank you all so much for being here, and have a good evening.
yeah. Everyone, take care. Bye now.